There was a dry eye or a face of millions of people around the world that did not have a smile on their face of all the tens of millions of supporters of the Cuban Revolution on Wednesday when the Cuban Five arrived in their beloved homeland. I mean, I haven't been able to watch any of those videos or pictures without bawling. It's like, so I want to, this is a preliminary orientation, a conversation, talking points about what happened. And I want to just remind comrades a little bit about the case of the Cuban Five and things like that. Many of the comrades and friends of the Cuban people thought that Antonio, who had the longest sentence, that he might actually die in the United States. And his mother always feared that she would die before he came home because he had 2 life sentences. And it has been 16 years. But those of us who really know the Cuban Revolution, I don't think ever doubted for one moment that the Cuban Five would not go home. We knew it would be a long struggle, but we knew that thanks to the skills and the ability of leaders like Fidel and Raúl and Ricardo Alarcón, who devoted much of his time to the case of the Cuban Five, we knew that they would come home. And it has everything to do with their skills and ability to move whatever mountain they had in front of them to get this done. And what happened on Wednesday, the fact that Obama announced a new phase of US Cuba relations at the very same hour, at the very same moment that Raúl in Cuba was also announcing, it shows that they absolutely coordinated this announcement, that they both took the mic at the very same time. And Obama announced a new phase of US-Cuba relations, which I'm going to talk a little bit about. And the Cubans announced, that the Cuban Five were coming home. So this triumph for the Cuban people and all the supporters of the Cuban Revolution, this ability for the Cuban leadership to get those comrades home is going to enter the chronicles of history because of how the Cubans were able to win this victory. Remember that, first of all, they should have never been in jail. Anyone who followed the trial 16 years ago in Miami knew that it was a complete sham. It made absolutely no sense. It was chicanery. It was hostile. Witnesses and people in the courtroom at the first days of the trial were harassed, followed by the right wing. One of the lawyers, who was a court-appointed lawyer, actually was his reality was changed by being part of that case. He couldn't believe, the mechanizations that took place. And he later, although he was a mainstream lawyer, he later became a strong opponent for the freedom of the Cuban Five. Just this trial was so horrible. I remember being in the early days of the case, I remember being at an event in Rutgers University where Leonard Weinglass, who was one of the lawyers, was speaking to a meeting of law students in Rutgers, and they were asking him all these kinds of questions like, well, but what about this? Well, that doesn't make sense. Well, that doesn't make sense. And he tried to tell them, this doesn't make any sense because it's a farce, because it's a sham, because they politically moved so that they would arrest these five. It's not going to make sense. This is not going to be won legally. This is going to be won politically because this was a political case. The five were charged with being terrorists when in fact they were fighting against U.S. terrorists. And now they are home. So I want to talk a little bit about So we are absolutely ecstatic by this victory. And the party sent, notices to many. I texted Ariel from the Cuban mission, right away, and I said, congratulations, and everything. And his reply was, well, this is your victory too. This is all of y'all's victory too. I mean, just that kind of humility, right? So a little bit about what was announced. What was announced by the Obama administration. First of all, just remember that the media and others talk about an embargo. It is not an embargo. It has never been an embargo. We cannot use that word because an embargo implies that it's an economic and political. Oh, Monty's here. I'm so glad. I was worried about you. Because an embargo implies a relationship between two countries, and that's not what this was. This was a blockade that was well organized, that was economic and political. US imperialism bullied and sanctioned and demanded that third countries apply economic hardships, prevented third countries from trading with Cuba. So this was a full-fledged blockade. And this is a blockade that has been codified, has been put into law. So Obama's announcement cannot override the full impact of the blockade. All it did was get some reprieve, and as Raul quickly pointed out on Wednesday in his announcement, he said that the essence of the blockade still is intact. What it does is it does leave some, it does have lift some travel restrictions. There can be some more economic exchanges. The press is making a big deal about U.S. people being able to buy rum and cigars as if that's all this is all about. Of course, we do want our Cuban rums and our Cuban cigars, but that's not what this is all about. And whatever progress was made, we must keep in mind that one of the elements or one sector of the ruling class that was pushing for these changes was elements such as the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. U.S. imperialism is running out of markets. It's running out of places where it can sell its junk, and so forth and so on. And so there is an element within the ruling class here in the United States that does want this market, and so it's not just that Obama is a good guy, although I have to admit you were kind of like, finally Obama, you did something, it did have this persona, like he did give a diss to the right wing, the Cuban Americans who are fascist, racist right wingers out of Florida and New Jersey and other places were appalled, and of course came quickly out against this and said. But let us not forget that from day one of the Cuban Revolution, U.S. imperialism has tried everything to sabotage the Cuban Revolution. And one of the things that has been so clear, and this is important for us because I know that a lot of people are concerned now. A lot of people are thinking. I got a lot of calls about this, which was interesting. A lot of people are afraid that now that there's some normalization of relations, that somehow the revolution is going to be undermined. Don't forget that from day one, part of the reason why U.S. imperialism, for example, had to carry out the Bay of Pigs in the early 60s was because they couldn't find an internal element. There wasn't enough in the country that U.S. imperialism could use to undermine the revolution. In other words, the Cuban Revolution and the masses that it defends, the Cuban leadership and the workers of the country are one and the same. And they have never been able to find a solid opposition inside the country to do its dirty work. And that's why they've had to do all this other, assassination attempts, the economic blockade, and so forth and so on. But it hasn't been able to succeed in all these years. We have to have a tremendous amount of confidence in the Cuban Revolution. And remember that it has gone through many trials and tribulations. It went through the special period when the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 90s. The Cuban people faced hardships that were untold. People were hungry. People were thin. People had to get up at 3 in the morning to walk to work because there wasn't enough gas and enough transportation. Things were very difficult in Cuba in that time. Any other country that suffered the dramatic losses that Cuba suffered in the special period would have had rebellions and riots in the streets. You didn't see that in Cuba. Just the opposite. The Cuban government with the Cuban people worked together to find ways to overcome these hardships. Just about 5-6 years ago, Cuba is, of course, within the contents and the confines of a mainly world capitalist system, is it not? It's this tiny island, of socialism, an attempt to build socialism, attempt to bring communism to the world. And it has never retreated from that effort, but it's hard. It's hard, especially when the rest of the world is capitalist. And just a few years ago, they also had to lay off workers. And of course, US imperialism and the propaganda here played it up as if that the government was laying off government workers as things were happening here in the United States. It wasn't the same thing. It wasn't the same thing at all. The government with the unions, with the mass organizations, worked to try to find a solution. And in fact, they held meetings, which is what they always do. Part of the reason that you can, with all confidence, say that the Cuban Revolution and the government are one with the masses is because of how they deal with things ideologically. When they had to deal with this new phase of economic hardship a few years ago, like 5 years ago or so, they had meetings throughout the country to discuss this plan, this, long documents. The ration book was going to be reviewed, so forth and so on. All these changes were having to be made. There was 8 million people, 8 million plus people participated in meetings across the country to take up these changes. The unions, the women's organization, the youth organizations, all these meetings were held, to discuss, how to deal with the current problem. You would never have anything like that here. So this is one of many examples of why we say that we're confident that in this new phase of US-Cuba relations, the revolution will go forward and survive and build socialism, even though it's so difficult. So, we have to continue to write about in the days ahead about what the actual announcement that Obama made. We have to do that. But before we get all in a tizzy about what he announced, keep in mind that Guantanamo Bay is still in Cuba, that U.S. imperialism still occupies a naval base there, and in fact has carried out torture, particularly of our Muslim brothers and sisters, right on Cuban land, which must be so difficult for the Cubans to have to face, to know that that's happening on their land, right, who would never torture anybody like that. I want to say a little bit about Alan Gross, because the media is portraying him as, oh, poor guy, he suffered so much, and first thing he wanted was a bagel and blah, blah, no offense to bagel lovers anywhere, but this man, was doing work for the CIA, was doing work for the Pentagon. He was caught and tried in a Cuban court, and he was caught for attempting to put in military kinds of communications in the island. He wanted the terrorists in the Pentagon to be able to communicate with people in Cuba. He should be grateful that he wasn't, that things weren't worse, and so he is And this is something, the negotiations that took place Wednesday, the freedom of the five, as well as the normalization of these new kinds of relations with U.S. were 2 years in the making. It wasn't something that just happened because, the right wing went after Obama. This has been something that's been going on for a couple of years, and there's been world leaders, including the Pope, that played a role in this. The announcement also comes within the context that U.S. imperialism is still aiming to sabotage the Venezuelan revolution. And we can't forget that they're, at the same time that they lifted some restrictions against Cuba, they also, the day after Obama, on Thursday, Obama signed sanctions against some of the Venezuelan leaders. And there is a very dangerous hostile campaign against the Venezuelan leadership and the Venezuelan revolution, comrades. We have to be alert to that, that they, Venezuela is the new Cuba in so many ways because Cuba is so solid and the leadership is so solid. And so it's got to go after Venezuela the way it's been going. And this is very important because there's assassination attempts against Maduro, President Maduro of Venezuela as well. So I want to say a little bit about Assata Shakur, because there's been a lot of stuff in social media, some of it, mainstream, some of it among the progressive community, that there's danger. Of course, when the announcement came a couple years ago, I think it was, that Assata was the first woman that was put on the terrorist list, and there was a $2 million bounty that was placed on her head. Of course, this is alarming. Of course, we need to be worried about our sister. This was an attack against Cuba. I remember going down the New Jersey Turnpike when this first came out, and you saw that sign, and you're like, oh my God, this is so dangerous. It's a message against the black struggle in the United States. It was a message against the Cuban Revolution. It's right wing. It's dangerous. But we have to know in our bones, comrades and friends, that there is no way that the U.S. imperialists can go after Assad as long as she's in Cuba. We have the utmost confidence that our Cuban comrades have her security and safety well in hand, and that she is not in danger as long as she is in Cuba. I say that with all confidence, it doesn't mean that it's not worrisome, of course, because sometimes she meets with people in the movement. When U.S. delegations go, and people who look like us, that sound like us, that talk like us, aren't always us. They're not always movement people. And CIA spies can get into delegation trips, but they're careful, and we're confident, that her safety is at hand, and we have to be sure that we know that their Cuban comrades know what they're doing. So I think I want to end with that. There is a lot of concern about what's going to happen now. That there's a little bit of normalization of relations, and that there's more economic ties, and more U.S. citizens or U.S. people from the United States will be able to travel to Cuba. And there's concerns that the socialist fabric of Cuba will be eroded as a result of this. We are confident that the Cuban Revolution and its leadership will continue to build socialism in this period as they have done under every other period. We are confident that our Cuban leaders and revolutionaries are going to defend socialist thought. When we were on the caravan a few months ago, and one of our stops was in Washington, D.C., and the FMLN had an event that they invited our caravan onto. And the event was to applaud and celebrate the victory of a former FMLN guerrilla in El Salvador who had been elected to its presidency, Salvador Seren. He was a former FMLN guerrilla, and he is now the president of El Salvador. And the event was commemorating this event, and they had the Venezuelans there speaking, and we were guests, and we got a chance to speak at this event, and the Salvadorans gave these wonderful presentations, and it was a wonderful event. And the Cuban representative from the U.S. interest section spoke at that event. And he was a young Afro-Cuban. I don't even think he was 35 years old. And he spoke at the event. And he was the one who spoke with all the experience of a 50-plus revolution. He's the one who spoke to the Salvadoran comrades and said, your struggle has just now begun. Your task of building a society for the Salvadoran people has just begun. And he gave this wisdom and this advice that only comes from a revolution that has its youth in its leadership. Raúl Castro said of the Cuban Five that they are examples, but they are not exceptions. And that is the damn truth. There are many Cuban Fives in the Cuban Revolution, in the society. There are cadre and leaders who know that the only solution for the Cuban people, the only solution for the masses of the world, is to fight and defend for socialism. And so no matter what this new phase of US Cuba relations has opened up, we are absolutely confident that our Cuban comrades will continue to defend and build the socialist Cuban revolution. Thank you.